Who, what, where, when, why, how. I know what you're thinking. Wait. We already learned all about questioning. And you're right. But this week's lesson is not about questioning. It's about how we use those questions to create a really important element of the reading process: summary. What is summarizing? To summarize means to condense important information into my own words. Summarizing is when we pull out the key ideas from a text and put them in our own words. When we summarize, we take away most of the extra details and focus on the main idea and key details. We try to relay the gist of what we read. Even though it is something you have probably done many times before, summarizing can be difficult for two reasons. First, we must decide which details are important and which details can be left out. The larger the text we're summarizing, the more difficult this task can be. Second, when we summarize, we should put those ideas in our own words. Many writers spend a great deal of time picking the best words to use, so we tend to feel more comfortable and confident using their words. However, when we put a summary in our own words, it shows that we understood what we read, and it'll also be easier for us to remember. Why is summarizing important? Like all of the previous strategies we've learned, summarizing helps us think about what we're reading. Summarizing can both tell us that we understood what we read, and it can also help us remember that information. In order to create a summary, we need information. So if we can form a summary of a text, then it tells us that we have a pretty good understanding of what it said. For this reason, it's important that we stop and summarize what we've read, even when we're not asked to. If you find that you are having trouble summarizing what you've read, that indicates that you might need to go back and reread a section, or you might need to ask for help, like from a teacher or classmate. If you're reading an independent novel, difficulty summarizing could also tell you that the text might be too challenging right now, or that you're just not interested in it right now. Additionally, the longer a text is, the more difficult it will be to remember everything that was included. Since summarizing pulls out the most important ideas, it will help us focus on remembering the most important details. Summarizing is an important part of the reading process, so the more we practice, the better we'll get at it. How do we form quality summaries? As mentioned earlier, summarizing can be difficult to do. Here are some of the common mistakes students make when we ask you to summarize. You write way too much, you don't write enough, you use run-on sentences, or you copy what the author wrote. To write a quality summary, focus on answering key questions: who, what, where, when, why, how. Break down the major ideas and put them in your own words. However, this is where summarizing starts to get complex. Though the 5 W's and H questions can help you begin narrowing down information, most often, we will not need to or be able to answer all 6 of those questions in our summary. Sometimes we won't have the information, and sometimes the information just isn't necessary. In the end, it's up to the reader to determine what is most important. If we practice summarizing every time we read, whether we're reading fiction or nonfiction, our ability to discern or figure out what is most important will continue to improve. Let's take a closer look at these 6 questions to see how they can help us create a quality summary of what the Reading for Mastery class is. When we ask who, we are looking for the main characters, people, or group involved. Who are we talking about when we talk about RFM? It probably isn't enough to say students, or even Revis students. We can be specific without including too much information by saying RFM students. When we ask what, we are looking for the main event or purpose. What happens in an RFM class? It isn't enough to say that the students learn, since you learn in every class. And saying that students learn to read isn't accurate either, since you already knew how to read when you got to Revis. We also don't need to give a day-by-day account of class either, since that would be too many details to include in a summary. Instead, we could say, RFM students improve their reading skills. When we ask where, we are looking to narrow down where the events mostly take place. Sometimes the where is a vital piece of information in a summary, and other times this information won't be necessary. In fact, sometimes you won't even know a specific location. If you can identify a location, you as a reader will need to make a judgment as to how specific to be, since most events in both the fiction and nonfiction world will have multiple settings. So where does RFM mostly take place? We probably don't need to provide the school's address or list individual classrooms where the classes meet. Instead, we can narrow it down enough by saying, Reavis-High-School's RFM students improve their reading skills. When we ask when, we are looking to narrow down when the events mostly take place. Sometimes this question is really important, and sometimes it's not always necessary. For this reason, we're going to use the following rules. If the events take place only in the present day or near the present day, you can omit or leave out that information if you don't have a date or if it doesn't logically fit. If the events take place in the past or the future, you should try and indicate that as specifically as possible. How specific you get depends on what you're talking about. In some cases, you might be able to give an exact date or year. In others, you might include the decade or century. And yet in others, you might only be able to say, in the past or in the future. So, when does RFM take place? In this case, you could provide the school year or even the class periods, but since we're talking about the present day, we can feel comfortable omitting or leaving out that information since it should be implied or suggested that it's happening during the class. Our summary should stay, Reavis-High-School's RFM students improve their reading skills. When we ask why, we're looking for the reason the events are happening. Answering this question can be difficult because we need to understand the motivation behind the event, and in many cases, the answer could be quite complex, including several different reasons. Again, we as readers will need to make a judgment as to whether or not this information is necessary in a summary. Let's look at our summary of RFM as an example. Why do students take RFM? The answer is to become better readers. In this case, we already covered that information, so we do not need to repeat it because that would be redundant or unnecessary. We can leave our summary as, Reavis-High-School's RFM students improve their reading skills. When we ask how, we are looking for the process that allows the events to happen. Just like with answering the why question, this part of a summary requires readers to determine if the information needs to be included in the summary, and then how much information to include. If we look at our summary of RFM, we can see how this can be challenging. Since we didn't answer the why question, answering the how question would help provide more details to really explain what makes RFM so unique from, say, an English class. However, it would be very easy to include too much information. We need to determine just how much is enough, so let's think about some of the major activities that take place each week. Independent reading, computer programs, vocabulary work, writing activities, reading activities, and discussion activities. If we can condense that information in a clear and logical way, our summary would be more specific without including too many details. In fact, since the sentence is beginning to get lengthy, now would be a good idea to split some of this information into a second sentence. As a result, we could end up with a summary that says, Reavis-High-School's RFM students improve their reading skills through several different activities. Each week, students do independent reading, use computer programs, and complete other activities that support vocabulary, writing, and discussion development. Notice that even though we originally said we didn't need to specify the when, it helped to add each week as a transition to begin our second sentence. This summary of RFM has pulled out the most important details without including too much information. It is specific enough to show how the class is different from other classes and briefly previews some of the major topics covered in the class. I'm sure you're thinking that took a long time to come up with 2 simple sentences, and you're right. While it may take some practice, hopefully the more we work on our ability to form quality summaries, the better and faster we'll get at it. What are some examples? Now that we have a good idea of what summarizing is, why it's important, and how to use it, let's take a look at some examples. You are reading the following section from a textbook in a woodworking class about different types of saws. How would you summarize what a miter saw does? A compound miter saw is a common tool used in woodworking to make straight, short cuts at a precise angle. This is a stationary saw that must be set on a stable work surface, such as a workbench or table. The saw blade sits in a unit above the material to be cut and is gently pressed down by the user to make the cut. Because of the limited range of the blade, this type of saw is used to cut boards, with the smaller version cutting up to 5.5-inch lengths and the larger version cutting up to 7.5-inch lengths. The user can adjust a miter saw in two ways. First, the saw can be adjusted along the horizontal axis to make mitered cuts. To make a miter cut, the blade is spun to the right or left, usually up to 60 degrees in either direction. Second, the saw can be adjusted along the vertical axis to make beveled cuts. To make a beveled cut, the blade is tilted to the right or left, usually up to 45 degrees in either direction. Many modern models include both a scale to indicate these angles, as well as a laser line to help the user line up the cuts. The ability to make precise, angled cuts, in addition to the limited width of the cut, make a compound miter saw ideal for cutting molding or baseboard. Let's use our 5 W's and H to answer the question, how would you summarize what a miter saw does? Who? In this case, you could say a user or a woodworker. Since woodworker is more specific, let's use that. What? This is important. What does a miter saw do? It makes angled miter and bevel cuts. Where? We probably don't need this information. When? We probably don't need this information either. Why? This would be helpful. Why would a woodworker need a miter saw? The answer is to cut boards like molding or baseboards. How? This is also helpful. How does a miter saw work? The user can twist or spin the blade to make angled cuts. Put this information together to create a summary of the text. Remember that you can use multiple sentences if needed. Your summary might say something like, a woodworker uses a miter saw to cut boards, such as molding or baseboards. The blade can be spun or tilted to make both mitered and beveled cuts. This summary provides key details that would help you explain the difference between a miter saw and other types of saws, like a table saw or a jigsaw. Let's try again. For your early childhood education class, you are supposed to create a lesson to teach preschool students about the weather. You need to pick a story or poem to use and summarize it for your teacher in the lesson plan. Use the 5 W's and H to summarize the following poem by Christina Rossetti called The Wind. Who has seen the wind? Neither I nor you. But when the leaves hang trembling, the wind is passing through. Who has seen the wind? Neither you nor I. But when the trees bow down their heads, the wind is passing by. How can you summarize this poem? Try filling in the 5 W's and H on your own. Now, use that information to create a quality summary of the poem. Your summary will probably be worded a little differently, but it should say something like, this poem explains that no one can see the wind, but we know it's there because it moves the trees and leaves. This summary includes enough information for your teacher to know that the poem you chose fits the assignment. Recap. Summarizing means to condense important information into my own words. When we summarize, it tells us that we understood what we read. It also helps us remember the most important information, so we need to make it a habit of summarizing every time we read. Writing a quality summary can be challenging because we need to decide what information to include and what to leave out. To find the main idea, we should think about the 5 W's and H. Who, what, where, when, why, and how. And always put our summary in our own words. That wraps up our flipped lesson on summarizing. If you have any questions about this strategy, feel free to watch all or part of the video again, or ask your teacher when you return to class. Click the link in the description box below to access a Google form for this lesson.